Thank you, Andrew, and I'd just like to add my welcome to our home here at Deloitte. Andrew introduced his organisation, so I'll introduce ours. We're accountants and consultants. Consultants actually had a bit of a difficult name, actually, with the new government in the early days. And I thought accountants were all right, actually, until the Prime Ministerial statement at the weekend about accountants. So we're just Deloitte for today. The report, I'm just going to say a few words of introduction and try and context it for you and sort of throw out a few thoughts about some of the challenges that we've pulled together in the report. So I'm going to try and do all that in about 10 minutes or so. We pulled together a report from about 500 pieces of publicly available data. So all the stuff that's in here is from government statistics or from IFS statistics or other available data. And we put it all together in something that we think is quite readable. It's less than 50 pages, so it's fairly condensed given all the various sources. What we've tried to do, it's not a political document, so we've tried to analyse everything through a business lens, really, looking at the business of government in the same way that we would look at a regular business, if you like, recognising that there are differences. So looking at the key metrics, challenges and potential actions. We do highlight where we think there is some work to do, and we see this as really a bit of a call to action, call to arms for government and business together, because there's a lot of work still to do, as we'll talk about. So let me just talk about the context and some high-level numbers, and many of you will have seen these in the budget statement and subsequent debate, but just to context everything. Over the next 5 years, we're going to increase public sector borrowing by 338 billion, with an increase in tax revenues of only 144 billion. All of the government's forecasts are predicated on business investment growth of over 7% per annum. And at the same time, 81 billion has got to be taken out of the cost of providing public services each year. You know, the memories of the spending review when the government came into power in 2010 are really fading fast, but a huge amount of the heavy lifting is still to be done. So 88% of the welfare cuts have still to come through, and 94% of the other spending reductions have still to come through. So we're at sort of the foothills of the mountain, really. We haven't even got halfway up. And just translating that into employment, it's about 100,000 fewer public sector employees for each of the next 5 years. So what I'd like to look is just unpick that a little bit and look at the tax bit, the income side of the equation for government, where business fits in, and then just some of our thoughts about the business of government and where potentially improvements can be made. So tax receipts. There's been a huge amount of noise about tax and big companies, big people paying more tax and extending the tax base and so on. But the reality is this can probably only be a small part of the equation. Tax receipts as a percentage of GDP have hardly varied at all over the last 22, 23 years. They go up and down within about a 2% range. So just to give you an idea of that, 1990, tax receipts were 38.4% of GDP. And then after lots of spend to save initiatives, lots of widening the tax base, lots of other initiatives all the way through, by 2012, that number was 37.5% of GDP. So 38.4% in 1990, 37.5% in 2012. So whilst, yes, some tax measures will have some impact, it can't be a big part of the equation. So let me move on to the challenge for business. This is quite a conundrum, I think, at the moment. I mean, government itself has identified something like 250 billion worth of projects to modernise infrastructure in the UK, some 500 projects. And that's quite apart from all of the spend that business needs to make in investing in itself. So what's the challenge? Well, in the Red Book, business investments budgeted to grow by about just over 7% over the next 5 years. That, in money terms, £58 billion more over that period. But over the 10 years to 2007, when we've got most reliable data, that number was 4.7%. So it's a step change required in business investment, which you might say, okay, that's possible. But at the moment, there is virtually zero growth in business investment. So plan is nearly 7.2%. We have been achieving 4.7% up to 2007. At the moment, it's a 0% growth. And it's a really tough issue because businesses are sitting at the moment with huge amounts of cash. FTSE 100 companies in the UK are estimated to have something like £750 billion of surplus cash over and above their requirements for day-to-day running. But they're holding on to it. We do a CFO survey looking at business confidence by finance directors of big companies, and they're pretty cautious still. They're not in the doomsday scenario they were during the height of the Greek crisis, the last Greek crisis. But you know, they're just moderately confident. They're not really interested in investing in huge projects because they're just not sure of the business environment. So there's a real roadblock here, actually, which government and business need to work together, both for government spending on infrastructure, but for business investment, on which all the plans are based. Let me just move on now to the business of government itself. So this is not, are you a Keynesian, aren't you a Keynesian, or whatever. It's really looking at just what goes through government every week, every day. And I'm just going to pick out 3 or 4 areas here. Cash management. One of the reasons that business has got that 750 billion of cash is it's got very, very good at cash management and treating cash as king. And I mean, to context it, every month 40 to 60 billion pounds goes in and comes out of government coffers. So a huge amount of money flowing through the system. But of that, 20 billion a year is written off. Bad debt, age debt, not collectible debt, big number. A further 20 billion is lost through fraud and error. Now, we know from HMRC that this has been a huge priority of theirs because they do see that there's a lot of action they can take there. But right across government, there is fraud and error, and it's a big, big number. So what can government do? Well, I think there's a lot of best practice from the private sector that could be imported into government. And we've done some modelling and some estimates, and we think about 8.5 billion could be saved by further fraud and prevention techniques, and a further 10 billion just through better cash management and eliminating some of those bad and age debt problems. But it's very micro. It does involve taking a very hard-nosed approach to cash management in the same way that business has done. And I know it's not a very sexy political thing to talk about, but you know, these numbers are quite big and they do make a difference. And I think there is a lot of good practice that the private sector can share with government on that. Targeting productivity. This is a huge issue for the economy as a whole. Private sector and public sector compared to our international competitors. But it is a fact that public sector productivity reduced by 0.3% per annum for the 10 years up to 2008. Now, you know, you've got to see that against the background of huge spending cuts, 20 billion a year having to come out of the health budgets, lots of 600,000 jobs coming out of the public sector generally. Does the government sector have all the tools and techniques to make sure that those reductions don't equate to reduced services? We'd suggest there's probably a lot to learn, again, from the private sector and some of the techniques to actually get more out of less. And it's a big issue. You know, we're going to have health trusts, schools, councils. All of those are going to enjoy greater financial freedoms, but do they have all the techniques to use those freedoms to do more with less? Finally, just the flagship programs of government. You know, we've got a lot of new programs. I think probably the highest profile one is the Department of Work and Pensions Welfare to Work program, which is a payment by results contract. We'll see how that works out. There's lots of other programs coming up in government across health, social, criminal justice services where there's going to be payment by results. Again, that's going to involve some real challenges both for government and business. For government, making sure that it procures on the right basis and make sure it has the leverage to make sure the private sector delivers. And for the private sector, frankly, to perform against the metrics that government wants. And I think there's still a bit of a gap there, really, in understanding how payment by results could work to best effect for government and for business. On mutuals, again, in the government's plans, and we cover this in the document, 1 million employees are planned to be transferred to mutuals. And when people are transferred to mutuals, everything's going to be all right. But of course, we know that that's only part of the equation. You know, mutuals will have to be run like businesses. They'll have to learn all the techniques of businesses. They'll have to diversify. They'll have to be competitive in their markets. Again, are they going to have the knowledge and the know-how to do that? I think there's a lot of learning, again, that can be transported across from the private sector and indeed elsewhere in the public sector. So a lot of stuff in this book in our less than 50 pages. So it is readable. And I said it is a bit of a call to arms because we don't really see this as a party political issue. I mean, you know, there is a huge amount for business to do. There's a huge amount for government to do. I haven't talked today about some of the longer term challenges with our demographics, aging population, retirement age, pensions, all that sort of stuff. We do cover all that in here. There's some pretty horrific numbers for early on a Thursday morning, but later on the weekend over a glass of wine you could read them. Thank you all very much for coming. I'll stop talking now. There's a lot to talk about, but we'll hear from the other speakers and then we'll have the question time. Thank you very much.